So this is session 12, and just as a reminder, the outline of the book, we've talked about this so many times, everybody should probably have this memorized now. Revelation 1:19, anybody ever ask you, the outline of the book of Revelation is right there in 1:19. Write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. So chapter 1 is all about the vision of Christ. Chapters 2 and 3 that we spent a whole bunch of time on are the seven churches. And then where we are now is in this period of time after the church, what we consider chapter 4 through 22. And we'll review chapter 5 tonight, but we'll mostly be in chapter 6. So Revelation 4:1, we've looked at this quite a few times as well. When John is writing, he says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven." And that word "after this" in the Greek is the word metatauta. The interesting thing is it's slightly worded different in the English, "be hereafter." It's the exact same words. So it technically would just be "things must be after this." So it's metatauta both times. So the Revelation chapter 5 is all about that scroll that we've talked about a little bit and that we've alluded to when we talked about this before. So I just want to briefly, because our real focus is on Revelation 6, but we've been away from Revelation for a little bit because we were doing our discussion in the book of Daniel, talking about the 69 weeks and the 70th week a little bit. We'll be talking more about the 70th week as we roll into this section. But the seven-sealed scroll, in Revelation 5:1, John says, "And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne, written within and on the backside, sealed with seven seals." So he saw a scroll. You see, it says a book in our English translations. It's really not a book. What we consider a book is a codex, and like with pages and things like that. But they really, in the first century, they were still using scrolls. And so this is a representation of a scroll. And as I had mentioned when we talked about this a little bit before we went into Daniel, this scroll is a title deed to the planet Earth. So Jesus is looking, he's in heaven, and John's right there with him, and John sees in the right hand of God the Father a scroll written on it. So Jeremiah 32, Jeremiah was told to buy a piece of property from his cousin. This whole thing about a title deed and the whole 70 years of captivity, which we've talked about. So Revelation 5:2 through 4, "And I saw a strong angel proclaim with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the book or open the scroll and loose the seals thereof?" And the interesting thing about a scroll, most of the time you would only write on one side of the scroll because there was a smooth side and a rough side. But this scroll, because it represents a title deed, there's stuff written on both sides of it. So when it's rolled up and you start cracking the seals and opening it, it's written on both sides. So it says, "No man was found in heaven nor on the earth was able to open the book, neither to look thereupon. And I wept much because no one was found worthy to open and read the book, neither to look at that." So this whole thing about this title deed and this scroll, I just want to quickly go back to mention the book of Ruth. We've talked about it a little bit before, a while back, but just the whole thing with Boaz being the kinsman redeemer and Naomi, um, the law of redemption and the law of the Levirate marriage. Because if you remember this law of the Levirate marriage, and this Levirate marriage thing has nothing to do with Levi. It's kind of it comes from a Hebrew word, but basically it's to allow for a female in the Jewish customs to be able to get land if there is no male heir, so that the land doesn't fall away from the people. And so that's really what's going on in the book of Ruth is Naomi is, she leaves because of the plagues going, or I guess the famines going on, and Ruth goes with her, and her other, oh, well, they go away, and then Ruth and her come back. Her other daughter-in-law doesn't, because she has two daughter-in-laws, and then both of their husbands died, and um, so they come back, but the other daughter-in-law doesn't, and but Ruth stays with Naomi. It's a really, really interesting story, and I highly recommend spending some time in the book of Ruth. Little four chapter book. So the land for Naomi, the law of redemption, because Naomi was entitled to land because there were no male heirs, but she is a daughter of Israel, so therefore she has an inheritance. But it needed to be redeemed for her. And Ruth takes that upon herself to redeem that. And Ruth is not a Jew. Ruth is a Gentile. She's a Moabitess, which is very interesting as well. So Ruth, the Gentile bride, takes part in this whole process of redemption of the land for Naomi. And the Goel, or Boaz, the kinsman redeemer. So to be a Goel, and the Goel is the one that can redeem the land for the female. So the Goel has to be a kinsman. So it can't just be anybody. It must be someone related to them. So Boaz was related to Naomi. But the Goel also must be able to perform the ritual of the Levirate marriage. Not only must he be willing to perform it, because maybe he's already married, so he must also be willing to do it. Even if he's able to perform it, he has to be willing, because just because he's not married doesn't mean he has to do it. And once he assumes the obligation, he must assume all the obligations. So not only must he redeem Naomi and get the land back for her, he must also take Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law, as his wife to fulfill the Levirate marriage.
To provide an heir for Naomi.
So that it gives Naomi an heir. Exactly. So Naomi has an heir. So all of these typologies, and it's interesting when you look at this, and the reason it's important is because Naomi is a type of Israel. She's not a type of the church. Ruth is a type of the church. She's a Gentile bride. So in order to bring Ruth to Naomi, Naomi had to be exiled from her land. These are very prophetic pictures of what the whole church age and the whole thing looks like, the whole plan. So Ruth, Naomi had to be exiled from her land. The Jews were exiled from their land. So what the law could not do, grace did. Jesus came in his grace to redeem everything. Now, Ruth does not replace Naomi, right? Didn't Ruth never replace Naomi? Naomi is very venerated and very highly revered. So is Ruth for her part in this, but they are not the same. They are not equal. They are different. So that she doesn't replace her. Ruth learns the ways of Naomi through and the Jewish ways about this to learn about Boaz through Naomi. So Naomi played a big part in this whole thing. And Naomi meets Boaz through Ruth. So when you look at this as the church in Israel, Israel will be reintroduced to their Messiah through the church. So they are both important in God's plan. And I talk about this often, that the church never replaced Israel, even though a lot of theologians like to say that they have. It's absolutely not true. We are different, and Israel has a special part to play and a special date with God that the church should not, nor America should get in the way of. So no matter how much Boaz loved Ruth, He had to wait for her move because Ruth had to go through the whole process. And Boaz, not Ruth, is the one that confronts the nearer kinsman. Like I say, I highly recommend going and spending some time reading the book of Ruth. It's a short little book. And the book, it's a literal book, but it's also a very prophetic book, as you can see from some of these typologies that we've gone through. So it's all very important in understanding the role of the kinsman redeemer. Jesus is the kinsman redeemer. Jesus is taking that scroll, that title deed to planet Earth, and he is doing the same thing that Boaz did, acting as the Goel. So what's interesting here in Revelation chapter 5, all the way through the first 4 chapters, all of the titles used of Jesus and all the symbologies used are very Gentile. They're not Jewish whatsoever. But when we're in Revelation chapter 5, we start to see these strong Jewish types mentioned. Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. There's one. The root of Jesse. There's another. So 2 major Jewish things that Christians are not related to, but Jews completely understand these terms. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne, in the midst of the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders, we'll talk about the elders in a second, stood a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth in all the earth. And we already talked about what the 7 spirits of God are. But these elders, what are the 24 elders? There's been a lot of speculation about the 24 elders, because you can see here, we're in heaven, we're in the throne room. The elders are here. The elders are watching this whole scene. So let's talk about who the elders aren't first. They represent a group. And the interesting thing is it's 24. And if you go to First Chronicles 24, with the whole thing about when the courts were set up for the priests to do temple worship, or really tabernacle worship that they were doing, David set up these companies of courts of groups, and there were 24 groups. It wasn't 24 individuals, it was groups. So these 24 elders can't be tribulation believers. So they're not tribulation saints. They're also not angels, because we're going to see them mentioned in Revelation 7. Now, just real quick, the tribulation saints. And one of the elders, look, there's talking about the 24 elders again, answered, saying unto me, what are these which are arrayed in white robes, in which they came? So the elders are asking, who are these people arrayed in white robes? And the next verse, and I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. And he said to me, these are the ones that have come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. These are tribulation saints. So that can't be the church, because the church is already been raptured, and these elders are observing this. So the elders are also not the tribulation saints. They're different. One of the elders answered, well, they're also not angels, because it says all the angels stood around the throne and about the elders and the 4 beasts, and fell before the throne on their faces and worshiped God. So they're not angels either. And then again in Revelation chapter 1 that we've already looked at, in the 7 lampstands which they saw are the 7 churches, and the 7 stars are the 7 angels of the 7 churches. So the 24 elders have some very distinguishing characteristics. They're given thrones in Revelation 3:21. They have a white raiment, Revelation 3:25. They have crowns of gold. They sing the song of the redeemed in Revelation chapter 5. And they're called elders, and they're called kings and priests. So there's only 3 entities that have been called kings and priests. One of them was Melchizedek, which we've talked about. One of them is Jesus. He's a king and a priest. And the third is the church. So these elders, it seems pretty obvious that we're talking about the church here and what these elders are. I know some people dispute that, but it's kind of hard when you look at these characteristics and you can put all this together. I think it starts to make sense. So these titles that we looked at, the Lamb, the Lion, they're Jewish titles. He's the Lamb at his first coming. He's the Lion at his second coming. We also see these symbols of power here that are mentioned in Revelation 5. There's 7 horns and 7 eyes. I'll leave those, there's a lot of scripture there, so I'll leave those for you to go review if you want to go read that. Now, one of the titles that's mentioned here in Revelation is he's called the Root of Jesse, or the Root of David. And so as the Root of David, there's scripture references to that in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, Romans, Revelation, even Matthew has references to it. So Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, he was from David's line, yet according to Matthew, he was the one that brought David and his line into existence. So he used this paradox in Matthew 22 to really try to mess with the Pharisees. You can see if you go read this passage in Matthew, they get really mad. Anytime the Pharisees get mad, that should be a big red light indicator to us. There's something here. The Holy Spirit's trying to show us something, because anytime the Pharisees go worked up, they're dealing with something that they're struggling with, some kind of heresy that they think is a heresy. And as a non-Jew, we don't understand a lot of those things. Also, in God's covenant with David, his line was to rule over the whole world. And it was even confirmed to Mary. So he's of the root of David. Now, I do believe that in the millennium, we'll talk about it when we get there, that David will probably rule over Jerusalem. His throne will be set up in Jerusalem. Jesus isn't going to rule the whole thing, but there's going to be people put in charge of cities and parts of the earth. So he came and took the book out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. So you can imagine this, God the Father sitting on the throne. Jesus walks up to him and he takes the scroll out of his hand. And he took it, and the 4 beasts and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them a harp and a golden vial of odors, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sung a new song, Thou art worthy. This is the elders and the 4 living creatures, all of them singing in one. Thou art worthy to take the book and open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests. There it is again. And we shall reign on the earth. Only group outside of Melchizedek and Jesus is the church that are called kings and priests, not Israel. Unto him that loved us and washed us of our sins in his own blood, and has made us kings and priests unto God our Father. To him be all glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. From Revelation chapter 1. So as Revelation chapter 5 is a pretty short chapter, and it's to set the stage for what's about to happen, because the seals don't get broken in Revelation 5. We don't start breaking seals until we get to Revelation 6, which is where we're about to land. But here,
Are you watching to see if Bonnie's in the waiting room?
I don't see her. If she left, she could have left, but I've got the participant screen up. I don't see her.
Check your phone, see if she texts. Okay, sorry.
That's all right. All right. So here's the thing. If you go read the news or go listen to the world, they say that, things are getting better. You'll hear this. Man tells us the world is getting better. You'll hear a lot of this in the secular world. In some ways, it's getting worse, but they'll always say it's getting better. But if you look at what the Bible says, it says it will get worse and worse and worse as we get closer and closer to the end. It's a sign of the times. Also, man says that peace among all nations is close at hand. And you hear this talk, talking about, having peace in the Middle East and all these things, and peace around the world. There will never be peace on the earth until Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom. There will be a false peace for a short period of time, but there will be no lasting peace. God says there will be wars and rumors of wars and kingdom against kingdom, Matthew 24. Also, man expects to win the battle against disease, famine, and hardship. You see this. They create all these vaccines. They create all these diseases and they come up with these vaccines to fight against them. They do all these things, but they think they can beat disease and famine and hardship. And the Bible says, no, that is not going to happen. God says there is fearful judgments of disease, of famine, and of hardship, which is what we're going to see in Revelation chapter 6. It gets very ugly very fast when those seals start breaking. Now, just as a reminder, we're in this interval period. We're in verse 26 of Daniel chapter 9 at the moment. Verse 25 is the 69 weeks. Verse 26 is the interval that we're in, the church age. And verse 27 is where we sit in the book of Revelation, where we are right now, going into chapter 6, moving into the 70th week of Daniel. So we're in this interval, the church age. There is going to be a time, we don't know exactly when, it could be very soon, it's very possible the way things are moving, where there will be some covenant that will be in force in the Middle East, most likely about the temple, to let Israel rebuild their temple. When this covenant is signed, we won't be here when this happens. This interval, somewhere in here in this interval, we will be raptured out of here somewhere in this interval before the tribulation. I've mentioned this before. I don't think that the day after the rapture that the tribulation starts. I think there's a gap, just like there is in other things. Now, is it a gap of like a month or years? I think it's probably years, but again, it's pure speculation on my part. I don't exactly know this, but from what I've studied and what I've gathered, and if you look at other gaps, it seems like there is some period of time, and there has to be some time to set the stage. And it also seems like it would need to be some time that would elapse for people to forget about these people all disappearing, and for them to start getting fed propaganda that they were taken by aliens or whatever else it may be. But at some point, I don't believe we'll be here. There will be a treaty that will be signed. Daniel 9 tells us about it. Jesus talks about this treaty. This treaty that will be signed will be a 7-year treaty of peace, but it'll be a false peace. I don't think this will be peace on the earth either. This is really just about the Middle East. So remember, the whole 70th week of Daniel is not about anything except Israel. Yeah, the rest of the world gets sucked into it all, but it's about bringing Israel to the wall until they cry out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So this tribulation period will start 3.5 years in, it tells us, that there will be an abomination of desolation. We've already talked about that what similar to what Antiochus Epiphanes did will be done again. It did not happen in 70 AD. I know some people like to say that there was an abomination of desolation in 70 AD, but there was not. That did not happen. It can only happen one other time. It happened with Antiochus Epiphanes in like 160 BC. That's the one Daniel talked about. And then what Jesus references it happening again is in the end times, not 70 AD. So after this abomination of desolation, the Jews will scatter and there will be but even throughout this whole period, there's going to be massive persecution going on. The Great Tribulation, though, will begin after the abomination of desolation. This is when we'll see when we get to Revelation 13. This is when Satan possesses the Antichrist. And this is when all hell breaks loose at a whole new level, as we'll see in some of the later judgments. This is known as the time of Jacob's trouble. The 70 weeks of Daniel is the entire 7-year period. But the time of Jacob's trouble, or the great tribulation, is only that last half. And it will be cut short, as Jesus said, because he said if he didn't cut it short, no flesh would be saved. At the end of the 70th week of Daniel, the second coming will take place. They will cry out, blessed is he who, whatever the remnants is left, will cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and he will come back. And we will go into the millennium, which we'll get into later in Revelation. So the 70 weeks is where these events, as we get into Revelation 6, is where this all starts. We get a false peace, abomination, desolation, great tribulation. Armageddon happens over here toward the end of the great tribulation. Rapture here, as I've already mentioned. Bema seat, which we'll talk about later in later weeks when we compare it to the great white throne judgment. And then second coming here, marriage supper of the Lamb, all happening. We'll be busy during the 70th week of when the tribulation's going on. We're going to be at the Bema seat getting our rewards, and we'll be at the marriage supper of the Lamb. So we're going to be too busy to be watching the tribulation take place. I don't think we'd want to watch it either. It's going to be pretty gruesome, as we'll see. And then the millennium, and then God binds Satan for a season, it says. All right. So the great tribulation. Jesus says in Matthew 24, there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. Now, I want to ask all of you an honest question, because people say this stuff happened in 70 AD. Was there such a time of peril that happened in 70 AD that has never been exceeded to this day? What do you think?
Well, some pretty bad things have happened after.
Yeah, lots of bad things happened. I mean, you've got
Holocaust.
Holocaust, and you've got World War One and World War Two, Crusades. So no, I don't know how anyone comes up with 70 AD and says that was that. And when we look at Revelation 6, tell me if those things happened in 70 AD. Okay, we'll continue here. And then Jesus says, except those days be shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So we know for a fact that this period is going to be shortened and Daniel tells us by how many days it gets shortened by. So it was prophesied in Daniel. Jesus is bringing it back up here, and he's saying why it's shortened, because no flesh would be saved. And this sounds like a technological statement more so than anything, because, if you go back to 70 AD, did they have a technology to destroy the entire world? Not really. They didn't even have muskets back then. They had swords and bows. I don't think you're going to destroy the entire world with swords and bows. Nuclear weapons, that's a different story. You could wipe out the entire planet many times over with those kinds of weapons. And then Daniel, at this time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of the people, of thy people. Michael is the archangel that is the watcher over Israel. We've talked about this before. And then he says, and there shall be a time of trouble, which has never was since there was a nation, even to this time. And at the same time, thou shalt people be delivered and found written in the book. So again, he's saying the same kind of thing. Jesus is kind of re-quoting Daniel here and what Daniel said, that there is going to be such a time of trouble, not since the world began and has never been until this point. So he's making it very clear. And then Jeremiah says, alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it, even the time of Jacob's trouble. Again, I ask you, how could this have happened in 70 AD? But he shall be saved out of it. So God is going to deliver Israel from this. Now, as we go into Revelation 6, I remind you of one of the last things Jesus did before he went to the cross, his triumphant entry. When he entered the city, Matthew 23, verses 37 through 39. He entered the city at the triumphant entry. Everybody was saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," and it was all coming down. But then the Pharisees told him to shut up. We talked about this whole thing. It's quoted in Luke as well. But they rejected him. And then he said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stone them that were sent to thee, how often I would have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chick under the wings." That was the purpose of all history. The tragedy, though, of all history is, but you would not. They rejected them. They killed the prophets. They killed all of those that were sent to them and continued to do so. And he says, now your house is left to you desolate. But then he says, you shall not see me henceforth until you say, and this is where it comes from. And it's quoted, he's quoting Zechariah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That is when he will come back, because they missed their day of visitation, as we already talked about when we looked at Daniel. Then we looked at that chapter 9 prophecy and that mathematical prophecy there that showed you the exact date that he rode in on the donkey. And he expected them to know that date, and they still rejected him. So the purpose of the tribulation is not for the church, has nothing to do with the church. Hosea 5 tells us the purpose of the tribulation. I will go and return to my place. Well, that's interesting. He said, if he is going to return to his place, that means he must have left his place to go somewhere. So Jesus came down at his first coming, and I will go and return to my place. So he goes back till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face, and in their affliction they will seek me earnestly. The tribulation does not begin until the Lamb opens the seal. When he cracks the first seal, the tribulation begins. People say it begins when the treaty is signed. That's partially true, but the treaty can't be signed until that seal is broken. And the Lamb doesn't get the scroll until the 24 elders have place their crowns on the glassy sea. When do we get our crowns? At the Bema seat of Christ. So at the Bema seat of Christ, oops, I went the wrong way. At the Bema seat of Christ, we get our crowns that he's going to place on our head. We're not worthy of those crowns. They're his crowns. So we're going to cast them at his feet. This is done right here in Revelation chapter 5. The 24 elders and the 7 lampstands are in heaven when the tribulation begins. This is the sequence. So the tribulation begins. For the great day of the wrath of the Lamb has come, and who is able to stand? Revelation chapter 6, verse 16 and 17, which is where we are headed here. And in the day of the voice of the 7th angel, when thou shalt begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished. Revelation chapter 10. And thy wrath has come. Revelation 11. This is about the wrath of God and the wrath of the Lamb. As it says right there, the wrath of the Lamb. People say, well, Jesus is nice. Jesus is not nice. Jesus is good, but Jesus is not nice. 7 angels will have 7 plagues that are going to be filled up with the wrath of God that we're going to see later in Revelation. Those plagues are brutal. They will wipe out most of mankind. And they will pour those bowls of wrath upon the earth in Revelation 16. And at the end of that, it'll all be over. So the day of the Lord, there's 20 times that it's mentioned in the Old Testament. 3 times in the New Testament. You have all the verses here in front of you that you can go review. The day of the Lord, the day of wrath, the day of the Lord's wrath, the day of darkness. So, Revelation chapter 6. This is where we break the seals. Here's the heptadic structure. We're going to have 7 sealed scroll. We're going to break 7 seals. And you're going to see where the first 6 seals are broken in chapter 6, but the 7th seal is not broken until chapter 7. There's an interlude in heaven in chapter 7 that we're going to see next time. Because all hell has broken loose through those first 6 signs that have happened, those seals that are broken. So there's an interlude, there's a pause in heaven. And we'll see that in chapter 7. And then after that pause, it's a 30-minute, it's interesting. It says it's a 30-minute pause, which is interesting. We'll talk about that next time, because it's like people say, well, there's no time in heaven. Well, apparently there is, at least in that case. So we'll see that. Then the 7th seal is broken. Once the 7th seal is broken, that'll unleash 7 more judgments. Trumpet judgments, as we call them. And they'll go in succession as well. These don't happen at once, as some people like to say. He breaks those scrolls, those seals. They have to be broken one by one. And trumpets sound one by one as it goes through these judgments. And then again, after the 6th trumpet, because it's so bad on the earth, there's another pause. And there is also some interlude. And we get some background on what's going on in the story, as we'll see in chapter 10 through 14. And then finally, we get to Revelation 15, and the bowls come, and the bowls are the final wrath of God. And there's one more interlude in Revelation 16 before the 7th and final bowl comes. And then Jesus comes back. So the 7 sealed scrolls start with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, we call it the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and we're going to talk about those here in just a second. But there's really 5. And people say, well, how are there 5 horsemen of the apocalypse? Well, you've got these 4, but the apocalypse is about Jesus in the end, and Jesus comes back riding on a white horse. So technically, he's a 5th horseman of the apocalypse. Just an observation. Okay. So Revelation chapter 6, verse 1. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, so he cracks open the first seal. And I heard, as it were, a noise of thunder, and one of the 4 living creatures, look what he says. You'll see this repeated. There's a structure here, and it's repeated. The first living creature says, come and see. So you can see here is the Greek word proceed. Come and see what's about to happen. Well, I had ChatGPT render me an image, and I didn't expect it to look so eerie, but that is what it rendered for me on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse today. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that we're about to see. There's a white horse, there's a red, there's a black, and then there's a pale horse, or a chloros horse, that we see at the end of this. But yeah, it actually did a pretty good job rendering that, didn't it? It only took like 3 iterations to get it. I tried to get it to make the one on the white horse look a little more handsome and not so wicked looking, but it wouldn't do it. All right. So the first seal, he cracks open that first seal. And I saw and behold. So he said, look what he said. He said, come and see. It's the angels, or the 4 living creatures. One of the 4 living creatures says. And so we go, he said, we look, and now we see, behold, a white horse. And he who sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he went out conquering and to conquer. So some people confuse this with Jesus Christ. Well, if this is Jesus Christ, he's in bad company. Because these other horsemen are you're going to see, they're pretty bad. This is not Jesus. He had a bow on his head, a crown on his head, and the crown here is not a diadem. It's a Stephanos. There's a difference in these crowns. It's a crown that was given to him as it's a ruler's crown. So whoever this is on the white horse, who happens to be the Antichrist, notice he has a bow in his hand, but he doesn't have any arrows. And the Holy Spirit's really specific when he describes these things, and John writes this down. So he has a bow, but no arrows. And I think that's a clue from the Holy Spirit that he's initially going to come as a man of peace and try to represent that. And that bow that we have there, that word in the Hebrew is the same. It's the same as the Hebrew word that we use for like the rainbow in Noah's day. So the Hebrew word is there, and then the Greek word. It can be a weapon, like a bow and arrow kind of bow, but he doesn't have any arrows. But it can also be a rainbow or a covenant. You remember this rainbow was the sign of the covenant that God made with Noah that he never destroy the earth with water again. So it could be an allusion to the covenant that he's going to make. Again, the horses, you can look those verses up. Horses represent judgment. I don't think these are literal horses. It's a symbolic thing about the judgment that's coming. Now, they could be literal looking things. I don't know, but they could look like that illustration. Who knows? But the bow could be a weapon, could represent a rainbow or a covenant. Well, Daniel tells us about this Antichrist. We always have to go back to Daniel in the Old Testament when we're trying to understand this man of sin. And it says in Daniel, and through his policy, he will cause craft to prosper in his hands, and he will magnify himself in his heart, and by peace he shall destroy many. So you can see he's using peace for his method of destruction. He promises peace, but it's a false peace. And then it says, he shall stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand, which we'll see toward the end of the book of Revelation when Jesus comes back at the second coming. He destroys them with the brightness of his coming and the breath of his mouth. He doesn't even have to touch him. He just destroys them. And then Daniel 9:27, and he, who we've already talked about, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. This is where we get this notion of this treaty, the 7-year process that brings peace to the Middle East. And in the midst of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Now, it's interesting thing is, they said it would take about 3.5 years, because people say, how can they be doing sacrifices in that time? Because that's like an abomination to God. It truly would be, because Jesus is a sacrifice to cover all those things. But it's interesting, the Temple Institute, who is behind rebuilding the temple, said it would take about 3.5 years to rebuild the temple and dedicate it for sacrifice. So it could very well be on the day of dedication of the temple, he comes in, sets himself up in the temple, declares himself to be God, and the ultimate abomination of desolation takes place. Some people have suggested he may sacrifice a child in the Holy of Holies. Don't know what he'll do, but it will be very dark, whatever it is. So the prince that shall come that we saw here, where here in Daniel, the prince that shall come will confirm a covenant with the many. So the prince that shall come is also the seed of the serpent. The very first reference we see to the Antichrist is in Genesis chapter 3. In verse 15, when the whole verse mentioned the seed of the serpent. That's one of his references. The idol shepherd in Zechariah is another reference. The little horn in Daniel, and the prince that shall come that we see in Daniel 9:26. Other allusions. Those are Old Testament allusions to him. There's also New Testament allusions. Those are that's wrong. Those are all Old Testament allusions, not New Testament allusions. We have Daniel. It says he's an intellectual genius. He's a persuasive orator, so he's good with his words. He's a shrewd politician. He's a financial genius, and he's a forceful military leader. All those references. There's some from most of them are the Old Testament. There's some New Testament references as well. New Testament allusions we have. He's a powerful organizer. It tells us in Revelation 13. We'll get there. And he's a unifying religious guru. So we have those references as well. Now, as I mentioned to you previously, there's only one physical description of the Antichrist in the Bible, and it's in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 17. Woe to the idle shepherd that leaveth the flock. The sword shall be upon his arm and upon his right eye. His arm shall be clean dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened. And I believe this could be why they take a mark on their right hand or their forehead in allegiance to what happened to him, because we're going to see in Revelation he's going to receive a fatal wound. And I believe when that happens, this is when he gets this appearance. So the scrolls. The first seal is the white horse. And this is the Antichrist coming in peace to make that treaty. The second horse is the red horse. The red horse represents war. Mars is red, it represents war. Revelation chapter 6, verse 3 and 4. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." Look, he says the second beast says the same thing the first beast said, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given him that sat upon to take peace from the earth, that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. Now, it's interesting that the allusion here is a great sword. What religion in the world today has a sword on their flags?
Russia, right?
That sword that they have. So it could be an allusion to that.
Wait, what did you say? I didn't hear what you said.
Because what I'd mentioned to you before, that this Antichrist probably comes out of the Middle East, not from the western part of the Roman Empire, most likely from the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So it's very well could be a reference to him here, but this horseman that he rides, this is war. So there is going to be wars globally. World War III, whatever it happens to be, but it's going to be a major war, and you're going to see that the death toll when these horsemen are done riding is astronomical. But that's just getting started. So the third horse is the black horse. And I think they kind of go hand in hand, because when you have wars that destroy everything, then you have famine usually that follows. I think there may be more to it than that. So then when he opened the third seal, so Jesus cracks open the third seal. And then the third beast says the same thing the first two beasts says, "Come and see." It's he telling John, "Come and see." And so I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he who has sat on him set a pair of balances in his hands. So black is often connected with famine. When you think about famine, it's usually dark, it's black color, those kind of things. So we think about famine in those regards. You can go to Lamentations and Jeremiah and see those ties into famine and the different ways famine can be introduced. And in Leviticus, we talk about to eat bread by weight. It's a Jewish expression. When we say we're going to eat bread by weight, because it'll tell us here, where is it? Here he is. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts saying, "A measure of wheat for a penny." He slides out of order. "And 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see that thou dost not hurt the oil and the wine." So this, to eat bread by weight, is an expression for food scarcity that's mentioned in Leviticus and in Ezekiel. Because there would be sieges against Jerusalem and against Israel where they would experience massive famine, and there's lots of stories of that in the Bible. But they would the idioms used, like a measure of wheat for a penny, 3 measures of barley for a penny. Those are references to famine. But it's interesting because he says, don't hurt the oil and the wine. Who benefits the most from oil and wine? Rich people. They have the olive oil, they have the wine. The poor people don't. So a measure of wheat is what we consider a full day's work. There's a reference to this in Homer. Herodotus makes a reference to these kinds of things as well. That a measure of wheat represents a full day's work. Also, Herodotus talks about this with Xerxes, that the armies of Xerxes, each soldier was given a measure of wheat, so it was their daily wage. Or a denarius that Matthew talks about is a day's wage. Now, again, as I mentioned, the oil and wine, those would be luxuries. Poor people aren't going to have these things. It's just interesting that he's told not to harm those, but to destroy other things. So this is a lot more than just a famine. What I believe this describes is a global rationing and controls. Imagine COVID on steroids. We saw a glimpse of this in 2020 with the craziness that ensued with, and it could have been a lot worse than it was. It was mostly a fear-based thing. There was some real stuff there, but it was mostly fear-based. It was to generate as much fear as they could. What I believe this is going to be is it's going to be a global rationing. There's going to be the wars are going to destroy the climate. They're going to destroy the water supplies and the food supplies, and there's going to be massive rationing going on, and the government is going to control who eats and who doesn't. And this probably mark of the beast kind of stuff here could very well be in force here. That you have to have the mark of the beast or you don't eat. We'll see more about that later. So the coming world leader will control the economy. We'll see this in Revelation 13:17. We'll see this in Amos 8:11. Now, I was reading something interesting today, and I just wanted to bring it into this discussion about rationing and famine, because I believe this is where America is headed. As of this morning, I looked at the national debt clock, and it was 34,674,290. You see the numbers there. That's $103,000 for every single person in America. So it's it can't continue at that rate. It's just out of control. Now, the problem is this is not the real national debt. They've taken so many things like Social Security and other entitlement programs off of the official books. You can go read about this and look this up. So they've taken these things off. They're still adding up. The actual debt, that the true national debt of the United States, I looked this up as well, is about $117 trillion. So multiply that times almost 4. That's what it really is. Well, how much money? I mean, just $1 trillion. How much is that? Well, if you stacked up $100 bills, if you stacked up $100 bills, the height of a chair, about a meter, that's $1 million high. If you stacked up $1 billion worth of $100 bills, that would go up 0.63 miles. If you stacked up $1 trillion, that would go 248 miles into space. That's a lot of, that's only $1 trillion. So you can see how these numbers look. So I think famine is definitely in the future, and rationing and these kinds of things. I don't hope we're not here, but I think we'll see those things. So we have these horses, the white horse, the red horse, the black horse. These are also, we won't get into it here, but if you go to Zechariah makes a mention of these 4 horses, and he presents them a little different way. So that's an interesting thing in a study of its own. The fourth horse. You can call it the livid horse or the chloros horse is actually what it is. Because when you look, it says, "Behold, and open the fourth seal, and I heard a voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see." Look, the fourth beast now says the same thing as the other three. They've all said it. And behold, a pale horse. And the word pale there is not a good translation. The word in the Greek is actually the word chloros, where we get our word chlorine from. And the name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given over them, over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. That's a lot in that one verse. So imagine this. Rapture happens. The population of the earth is about 8 billion people right now. Rapture happens. Let's be really liberal with our number, and let's say 1 billion people get raptured. That leaves 7 billion people on the earth. Once these first four seals are broken, you now have 25% of that 7 billion have been killed. And it's interesting too when it says the beasts of the earth. The word beast there is zoos. And zoos can mean all kinds of living things, including microscopic things like COVID and pneumonia and any of these other viral diseases. So it very well could be that part of this is going to be some new plague that, because you can see there's all kinds of viruses in the world that could easily bring great destruction. So this fourth horse is going to wipe out a fourth of what's left on the earth. So you got 7 billion people, take a quarter of that away. They're just gone. And this is all fast. This happens fast. This is not like because look, you're only got a 7-year period for the whole thing. So this is happening very fast. So the four horsemen, the white, the red, the black, and the green are the chloros horse. And again, my ChatGPT picture with these bad, sinister looking dudes riding through. So people say the church will be here for the tribulation. And they say, well, that's not the judgment of God. That judgment of God, they say, doesn't come until the very end of the tribulation. Well, who is breaking the seals? Jesus is breaking the seals. Whether Jesus is making the four horsemen ride, him breaking those seals is allowing them to ride. So I would call that wrath. I would call that judgment. And you're going to see at the end of Revelation chapter 6 that talks about the wrath of the Lamb. So Ezekiel makes a reference here. How much more will I send my 80 judgments upon Jerusalem? The sword, the famine, the noisome beast, and pestilence to cut off man and beast. So I believe, you could tie this back. The reference of these four horsemen, you can tie back to Ezekiel, and like I also mentioned to you, Zechariah. Again, there's always Old Testament allusions in these New Testament passages. Continuing in Revelation, and when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? These are the martyrs. These are your first tribulation saints that died during the tribulation. So the Greek word there is the word martys. That's where we get the word martyr, and it literally means witness. And if you look through history, the cry, Psalms mentions it. It's mentioned in Habakkuk. How long, O Lord? It's a cry for the people suffering through the ages. So notice these martyrs, these souls that are crying out here, they're not sleeping. They're conscious. First Thessalonians makes reference to souls being conscious and not sleeping as well. So they don't have a glorified body yet. They're under the altar. So their souls are there in heaven. Their spirits and their souls are there, but they are not in bodily form like we are at this point in heaven. They will get their bodies later at the resurrection that comes later. But so again, this is another way to separate the church out from this group. Because if you look at the things Paul says about the rapture, this is not that. And it says, white robes were given unto every one of them, and they said unto them that they should just rest for a little season until their fellow servants and their brethren should be killed as they were. And it should be fulfilled. This is a dark time. This is not. That's why the first, going through the 7 churches, that's pleasant time comparatively. This is hell on earth that we're looking at. So how long, O Lord? Revelation 6:10, does thou not judge and avenge our blood? Revelation 16:6, for they have shed the blood of saints and prophets and have given them blood to drink. Revelation 17:6, and I saw a woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So he's going to avenge all of this blood. It all comes at the end. For God hath avenged you for her. Revelation 18:20, as we'll see later. And in her was found the blood of prophets. He's talking about Mystery Babylon here. The blood of prophets and of saints and of the all slain upon the earth. Revelation 18:24. And hath avenged the blood of his servants at her hand. Again, Mystery Babylon. We'll get to this later in Revelation. So the seals. Our first four seals were the horsemen. The 5th seal was the martyrs. The 6th seal. And behold, when he opened the 6th seal, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became as black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. This is not a lunar eclipse. This is not a solar eclipse. This is something very sinister going on. Because look what it says, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. There is a shaking going on during this period.
So like meteorites?
Well, could it be also what do stars represent?
Planets?
They represent, at least in the book of Revelation, from what we've seen, angels. You remember going back to the early chapters of Revelation, this could be when they're cast down. It could also be an asteroid hitting the earth. It's one of those two kinds of things, because the sun becomes black as sackcloth and the moon becomes as blood. If you have an asteroid impact hit the earth, creates this dust cloud over the earth, it would make the sun look black as sackcloth. It would also make the moon look blood red. If you have seen pictures from areas of where they're near volcanoes that have erupted, and if you look at the moon on a regular night, it looks red as blood. And if you look at the sun, it looks black. So it very well could be, because he says this great earthquake. This earthquake is probably going to trigger a bunch of volcanoes as well. This is seismic upheaval like the world has never seen. What's coming with this stuff, this earthquake. You think that, a 9.0 earthquake is a big thing. This is going to be off the scale on magnitude of what this is. It tells you in other places in the Bible, it's going to shake the whole earth. It's going to move the earth off its axis, is what it says.
Fun stuff.
Aren't you glad you're not going to be here? And then continuing, And the heaven departed as a scroll when it was rolled up together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their place. This is serious stuff. You don't want to be here for this. It's interesting, too. There's a little bit of illusion here because it says the heaven departed as a scroll when it's rolled up. So he's given us a graphical illustration of what this is going to look like, of like a scroll just collapsing and roll. If you've ever taken a scroll that's unrolled and let go of it, it just kind of rolls in really fast and slams together. So he says here, every mountain and island are moved out of their place. This is that some of the earthquakes in recent years have shifted that earthquake. I think it was in South America a few years ago. They said it actually could be registered that it slightly changed the Earth's axis. This is going to be much more than that. Every mountain and every island are going to be moved out of their place. It's going to be a great shaking. And I do believe there will be not just seismic activity, but also volcanic activity with this. This is one of 3 earthquakes. We'll see 2 more earthquakes in Revelation. This one's in 6. There's one in 11, and there's another one in 16. These are literal earthquakes. They're not symbology. They're literal. Exodus makes mention of literal earthquakes. 1 Kings makes mentions of this. Matthew, Jesus said there will be earthquakes in various places in Matthew. So earthquakes, sun turning dark. Joel mentions sun turning dark. Lots of these things. The word used in the Greek for the shaking, the seismos. There's a whole bunch of references to the earthquakes. Again, you can read these in the interest of time. I'm going to continue through these. The sun became as black as sackcloth. The moon became like blood. Stars fell from heaven, even as fig trees cast us their untimely figs. See, Jesus even makes this reference in Matthew 24, verse 29, about the stars falling from heaven. And I believe that one, Jesus is talking about angelic entities on that one, but I don't remember for sure. It could be that he may be talking about, that may be the one where he's talking about the signs in the heaven that make people tremble in fear of what's coming on the earth. I think maybe that one. So are these, like the sky is rolled up and we see these metaphors or whatever, some kind of symbolic language. The sky and the heaven depart as a scroll when it's rolled together. Very similar to what's said in Revelation there. Every mountain and island are moved out of their place. Jeremiah makes mention of this. So Jeremiah has a reference to what we see in Revelation. Well, is it really a metaphor? Well, you see these Old Testament verses. Who alone stretches out the heavens? Stretching out the heavens like a tent curtain in Psalms. Who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in Isaiah? Yeah. Stretching the heavens. These are all the verses in the Bible stretching the heavens. Well, there's other mentions of it, that it can be, space is not an empty vacuum like they taught for so many years. Because it can be torn. Isaiah says it can be ripped and torn, Isaiah 64. It can be worn out like a garment, like it says in Psalms. It can be shaken. It can be burnt up, Peter tells us. It can be split apart. It can be rolled up. Now, the interesting thing is, how can space be rolled up? Because for something to be rolled up, it has to have multiple dimensions to it. It needs to, so you're going to need a dimension where space can bend into. So we're going to need additional spatial dimensions that we don't understand. This is where this multi-dimensional universe stuff comes from. Because in order for space to bend, it has to bend somewhere. So there has to be a 5th dimension for it to bend into, or a 6th dimension. Whatever there happens to be. Now, finishing up the book of Revelation, chapter 6 here. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman. It's interesting. The kings, the great men, the rich men, the chiefs, the mighty men, every bondman, every free man. So basically, this covers everybody. Everybody that's left on the earth, he's not, nobody gets special treatment. Notice the kings are in the same boat as the slaves. Everyone is in the same boat. And look what it says they did. They hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. Revelation 16:15. Why did they hide themselves? Well, it tells us in verse 16. And said to the mountains, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. So right there in Revelation 6, early in the tribulation, you have the wrath of the Lamb. And then it says, for the great day of his wrath is come, and who is able to stand? So anyone that says this business about that this whole pre-wrath thing said that, we'll be taken out before the wrath. Well, the wrath happens here. It's not the midpoint. It's right here, early in the tribulation. This is the wrath of God. And the interesting thing is, if you're a good scholar of the Old Testament, this is going to ring very true what you're reading right here about where he says that the kings of the earth said, they hid themselves in the rocks of the mountains and said, mountains and rocks fall on us. It's a reference to Joshua. And Joshua has some very strong parallels to the book of Revelation. I highly recommend a good read through at least the first part of the book of Joshua, up until the time he starts handing out the land, because it's very, and read it side by side with the book of Revelation. Joshua or Yehoshua is Joshua's Hebrew name. It's just a variant of Yeshua. Now, we're not saying Joshua is Jesus. It's not. He's a type. He was a military commander that was dispossessing the land of the usurpers. Jesus is a military commander going to usurp the land. Joshua had a 7-year campaign against 7 nations out of 10 originally. If you remember, and we'll see it in Revelation, and it's in Daniel as well, there were this 10-nation confederation, but 3 of them fall. So he's against 7. Also, the interesting thing about Jericho, the Torah was ignored. The Sabbath was ignored. The Levites were involved. They first sent in 2 witnesses. You'll see, we're going to see 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation coming up. There were 7 trumpet events. We're going to see those 7 trumpets. Also, you're going to see there's a silence in heaven for half an hour coming. Remember when they marched around the city once a day, and then on the 7th day they marched around it. They were silent when they were marching around it, and on the 7th day they marched around it 7 times and blew their trumpets, and the walls of Jericho came down. And then right after that, or as part of that, the enemies were confederated under the leadership of Adonai-Zedek. The name means the Lord of righteousness. He was not righteous. He was bad, but that's what his name means. He was defeated with hailstones and fire from heaven, signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. And it says in Joshua, the kings hid in caves and said, rocks fall on us. So John would be very familiar with this. So he understands the parallels that are going on here. The Lord of hosts has purposed to stain the pride of all glory and to bring all contempt, all the honorable of the earth. The first, second, third, fourth seals killed 25% of the population of the earth. Then on top of that, you have martyrs that are dying for their faith. And then you have all this cosmic upheaval going on. The heptadic structure. You group the signs together, Matthew, Luke, and Revelation. You start with false Christ, the white horse. Wars, the red horse. Famines, the black horse. Death, the chloros horse. Then the martyrs and the global upheaval. these all line up with the first 6 seals in the book of Revelation. Strong parallels between both of them. Now, I'm going to bring this up one more time because I know people still like to debate about it as we wrap this up. The way you interpret Revelation is vitally important. The preterists believe this all happened in 70 AD, and I think I've made a pretty strong point tonight even that this could not have happened in 70 AD. There's no record of it in any history book of it being the worst times in the history of the world. Also, the historicism, I can't say it right, past church history. They're saying it represents church history. No, it's not that either. The church and Israel are mutually exclusive. There's also an idealism version of it, which are what we particularly call the amillennialists and the postmillennialists, that it's just symbology. It recurs over and over again. And then there's the fourth, the futuristic, which is a totally futuristic approach to the whole thing. I think it's extremely important that people get that theology right because we are heading into some very, very dark times. In the rapture view comparison, I strongly support a pre-trib rapture. I've made mention tonight about why I don't think it can be some of those other positions like pre-wrath, because there's wrath throughout the entire tribulation period. As we can see, Jesus is the one breaking those seals. The devil's not breaking those seals. Antichrist isn't breaking them. Jesus is. He's the one unleashing judgment on the earth. Therefore, that's wrath, and he's not going to do that to his bride. Now, next time we'll get into Revelation chapter 7, and we'll learn about these 144,000 Jewish believers that are sealed from these tribes. Now, if you get a chance, look at the tribes that are there and look who's missing. We won't cover this tonight. We can talk about it next time, but what I recommend you do is you read Revelation chapter 7 and chapter 14. Look at this list, compare it to the tribes in the Old Testament, see who's missing, and why do you think they're missing? And then we'll talk about what are the role of the 144,000.